The greatest realization I made as a special operations coach is the importance of rucking, which if you train for it can take your chances of getting selected from 10% to 67%. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know to improve rucking, from the technique to real research studies, including a beginner and advanced routine at the end. Rucking is a fast walk, shuffle, or sometimes even a run performed with a heavy rucksack. In selection, you'll typically have 45 to 85 pounds of load in your rucksack, along with a dummy rifle weighing about 7 pounds in your hand. And rucking is probably one of the most practical skills you'll do at selection. The average ranger will enter combat with upwards of 100 pounds on their back, so if you hate rucking, you might want to rethink this career path. The minimum standard is a 12-mile ruck at 3 hours or less with a 45-pound rucksack. Keep in mind though, at selection the terrain is going to be uneven and you won't be completing your time rucks fresh or under ideal circumstances. You could be exhausted and fatigued, and depending on the time of year for your class, you could be in extreme heat or humidity. For this reason, your best ruck time prior to selection should not be at the minimum. A competitive rucking pace is 12:30 or less, and a good rule of thumb is that you should be able to sustain a 13-30-minute mile pace indefinitely. But why is rucking so important? There are 3 studies in the past 3 decades on SFAS, and each of them found that rucking performance was the greatest predictor of getting selected, more so than any other physical factors like running, pull-ups, or APFT scores. So if you care about getting selected, then you need to care about rucking. The average selection rate at SFAS was 31% during these years, and those in the top quarter of their class in terms of rucking performance had a 67% selection rate. So simply being in the top quarter of ruckers doubles the probability of getting selected. The next question is whether rucking performance scales linearly with selection rates. Well, it does. The bottom quarter of ruckers have less than a 10% chance of getting selected. The next quartile had a 43% chance, and the top quarter of the class had a 67% selection rate. Unfortunately, this 2019 study did not reveal what paces separate each of the quartiles, but based on recent athletes I've coached and who've been selected, they say the 12-minute per mile range will land you in that top quartile. There is a lot more data to cite here, so to receive these insights direct to your inbox as I learn them, sign up for free at the link in the description. We know that rucking is really important to getting selected, but how do you make the most rucking improvement in the shortest amount of time? Here are 3 studies and research papers on the subject which have influenced how I coach athletes to improve their rucking. The first is by Kramer, published in 1987, which evaluated the effects of strength training and aerobic training on a max effort 2-mile ruck with 99 pounds. 35 male soldiers were randomly assigned to 4 groups, with each training 4 times per week for 3 months. The study found that strength combined with aerobic training resulted in significant improvements in ruck march times. However, 0 improvement was seen in the aerobic training only group, and little improvement was seen in the strength training only group. This points to the idea that running alone will not improve ruck times. Instead, the study authors say that an optimal program should incorporate a combination of strength training and aerobic exercise. Another study by Kramer, published in 2001, reached the same conclusion. 93 female soldiers were randomly assigned to 1 of 4 groups and trained for 6 months. The women in the strength training and plyometrics groups showed significant improvements in 2-mile ruck times. On average, the improvements were 17% or 350 seconds. Interestingly again, aerobic exercise alone didn't improve ruck times. This is really interesting. Next, let's see what correlates most strongly with rucking performance and if it validates what we found so far. A NATO technical report summarized 8 different studies to identify what traits correlate most strongly with fast ruck march times. And across these studies, the results were remarkably consistent. They found fat mass, muscle mass, height, strength, and VO2 max were highly predictive of rucking performance. Interestingly, VO2 max was consistently at the bottom of the list, although it was correlated, and this lines up with the previous studies. The data points to the fact that if you want to improve your rucking performance, you should be building muscle, strength, and endurance. And if you're doing a program which ignores any of these, especially strength, you will have inferior results. And intuitively, this makes sense. If you have a skinny 150-pound guy who can run 6-minute miles for days, but who can't pick up 225 pounds off the floor, when you put half his body weight on his back and tell him to ruck 12 miles, he's going to struggle. Covering 12 miles will be easy for him, but his limiting factor will be his strength. And it doesn't matter how aerobically fit you are if you can't carry the weight. But what's the fastest way to get better at rucking? First, you need to stop thinking about rucking like you do calisthenics. Greasing the groove and brute forcing your way to improvement with high volumes and frequency will only result in injury. Plus, rucking is highly taxing and has a recovery cost much greater than strength training or running in isolation. Instead, I want you to focus on your limiting factors. Here's an example. Let's say that you go on a 35-pound ruck for 10 miles. If you're muscular but aerobically weak, I'll say that your heart rate was through the roof and you struggle to breathe. And if you tell me you were able to maintain postural integrity in your back for the duration of that ruck, in that case, your endurance is the limiting factor and we can directly target that. A different candidate may do that same ruck and tell me that his upper back, back, traps, and shoulders are exhausted, and they felt fine until mile 7, but the last 3 miles were a struggle. Where most people go wrong is they think they need to ruck more to improve the final 3 miles of that ruck, but it's just not sustainable or realistic to do multiple 8, 10, or 12 mile rucks per week just to target your upper back. Instead, we can do heavy rows, shrugs, and face pulls to train that area so it's no longer a weakness, and instead of feeling fatigue at mile 7, you can push that fatigue until mile 9, 10, or 11. This is what I mean when I say that rucking really exposes people's weaknesses. Now that you know how to address your weaknesses, let's dive into some research into ruck frequency and load. In the study, is intensity or duration the key factor in march training? Visser compared the effect of a standard long-distance moderate weight ruck to a high-load short-distance ruck interval. The study participants were officers at the Royal Military Academy and did 2 training sessions per week of both aerobic and resistance training. The study also separated them into groups which rucked twice per month or weekly to evaluate the effect of training frequency on performance. Over the course of the 8 weeks, the ruck weights increased significantly. For the moderate load group, ruck weight went from 20% to 32% of body weight, and the duration went from 90 minutes to 3 hours. The short distance groups increased their ruck weight from 45% to 67.5% of body weight, and the intervals went from 3 rounds of 15 minutes to 4 rounds of 15 minutes. Although all groups saw improvements in their ruck times, the interval group saw greater improvements, and by the end of the study, they were spending 1/3 of the time training compared to the longer duration group. Additionally, the study found that rucking once per week was more effective than rucking every other week. But rucking does carry a higher risk of injury than running, and we can mitigate this with proper technique. First is to not ruck run. Plenty of people get shin splints from unloaded running, and just imagine the additional force you'll absorb when running with an additional 50 pounds on your back. Those shin splints and injuries will onset much faster. Use this technique instead. Keep a slight hinge at the hips, a cadence of rapid short steps with unlocked bent knees where your foot is landing directly under your hips instead of strided out. You want your rucks to be speed walks as fast as you can move without striding into a run. Once you start running and landing your entire body weight plus the weight of the rucksack onto a single foot is where you run into real issues. Before getting into the training programs, here are strength and endurance guidelines I recommend you hit. First is to be able to run 6 to 8 miles comfortably. Ideally, the pace should be around 10 minutes per mile or faster, because if you want to ruck 45 pounds at a 13-minute mile pace, you need to have the endurance to do it unweighted first. And second is a 275-pound squat and 335-pound deadlift. Achieving those numbers tells me that you have specifically trained your lower back and legs with heavy compound movements. If you haven't met those standards, prioritize your running and strength work first. It's only through being strong and a fast runner that you'll actually have the foundation to be a good rucker. In the meantime, you can ruck every other week, but here's how you should do it. Even though the studies found that heavy ruck intervals were more effective than long duration, moderate weight rucks, the study participants were also trained subjects. This program is for anyone who has not met the strength and cardiovascular standards mentioned previously, or who hasn't worked up to a 90-minute ruck with 50 pounds. Start with a weight no heavier than 35 pounds and begin rucking 30 minutes per week, adding no more than 15 minutes per session until you reach 2 hours. When you're starting, the goal is not to break records with these rucks. It's simply to find a brisk pace that you can settle into with the previously mentioned form. Once you've achieved a 2-hour ruck with 50 pounds and have met the strength and cardiovascular standards, you can move on to the intermediate advanced rucking program. It keeps the long duration ruck, and we also add a high intensity mile repeat ruck earlier in the week. The purpose of the high intensity session is to acclimate you to heavy weights and practice moving quickly with the previously mentioned technique. The interval ruck is going to feel very heavy, but it makes your future rucks feel light. During your few minutes of rest, keep your ruck on and walk slowly. As you become more intermediate and advanced in your training, it's important to allow for some flexibility. You can tweak the number of intervals, the load, duration, or prescribed effort. I like to start my athletes with 2 half-mile repeats for the intensity ruck and 60 minutes on the long session. And I also adjust from week to week to ensure progress and recovery is on point. For a free beginner and intermediate and advanced program, check the link in the description. One reminder for your training is to incorporate deloads or periods where you reduce your mileage. Rucking injuries will onset much faster than those from running, so don't add more than several miles of rucking per week on this program, especially if you're working with heavy loads. So what kind of results can you expect? Well, if you're strength training, running, and rucking, 11 to 12 minute miles with 45 pounds is achievable, which would easily put you in the top quartile of your class. The one aspect we didn't cover is body composition, specifically how much muscle mass and body fat you should have on your frame. Click the video on the screen to hear the full breakdown. Leave your questions in the comments.